Uh, Good morning from the United States. Good afternoon, good evening, where I think many of you are today. I really enjoyed just catching the end of that last session, and one of the remarks that struck me was the comment around treating data as an asset. The reality is, for most companies, data is an asset, whether they recognize it or not, value it appropriately, recognize the long-term implications of having effective data or not. Now, that's a different matter. What I'm going to talk about today with you is really a sort of point of view on the universe after what is now 20 years of Net Promoter Score. And I'll summarize it up front so you get the gist of it. Also, you decide, I guess, whether you want to listen to the whole presentation. When we created Net Promoter Score in 2003, or at least published our work then, it was a breakthrough strategy. It was something that transformed businesses. But I would argue that subsequently, a lot of our approaches, methodologies, technologies that companies have used have simply failed to keep up with the realities of the marketplace. So it's time for companies to rethink what they're doing in this regard. And I would point to the fact that I think next generation approaches and opportunities around CX measurements are now fully available in the marketplace if companies want to use it. And we should anticipate that those technologies will have a transformational impact on the risk associated with your customer base, which is a very important element, especially in business-to-business companies, but certainly also in B2C. The speed at which companies can engage with their customers, which is a massive differentiation, and their ability to get teams aligned across organizational boundaries. And so I'll explain this as we go through the presentation. But first of all, let me start by casting back to 2003, when we published in the Harvard Business Review our research that led to really Net Promoter Score. And I think at the time, the singular insight that was provided was that customer experience leaders were enjoying substantial financial advantage over those that didn't lead, as measured by the Net Promoter Score. And that advantage showed up in multiple financial metrics. And there was a good deal of research that went into that prior 5 or 6 years, looking at data, performance of growth versus Net Promoter Score across multiple industries. Over the last 20 years, nothing's changed that basic conviction in our mind. We've seen more and more data that suggests that CX leaders, demonstrable leaders in markets, continue to have an advantage. But out of that data in 2003, really many management teams decided that they had an imperative to compete through customer experience. It became a top 3, top 5 issue in the boardroom. And subsequently, a massive increase in the adoption of customer experience as a strategy for competition, with pretty much a substantial plurality of the marketplace saying CX is one of our primary customer differentiation tools. Okay, but how have companies actually executed against that? Well, what most companies did in practice was they went off and they started surveying customers, and they started asking customers about whether they'd be recommended, which was the foundational question for NPS. They established goals for Net Promoter Score. They want to see improvement. And they typically held management teams accountable. And this was really the core 3 strategies companies did. Has that worked? Well, overall, quite disappointingly, our research suggests that 95% of programs don't have any form of significant financial impact on the company. So you're measuring, you're holding people accountable, it's just not making any meaningful change in financial outcomes. Furthermore, every time a leader changes, you get this gut-wrenching shift in strategy, and often customer experience programs are dropped. And that indicates to us that CX is not a solidly founded business strategy as much as it is, say, a belief system amongst certain leaders. So on the other hand, early adopters, the companies that grabbed the imperative back in 2003, rapidly invested energy in trying to create leadership through NPS, trying to be ahead of their industry, and were honest with themselves about their performance and what they needed to do to improve it. saw most of the benefits accrue. So you saw this sort of two waves. You saw these initial wave of adopters did really well, very aggressive. You saw the late adopters come in, really not make any progress. And the differential is quite stark. Some research we've done with Bain and Company indicated that the differential in terms of growth rates between the companies that could really execute versus those that couldn't was quite remarkable. And this wasn't just affecting growth, it was affecting profitability, it was affecting cost to serve customers. So if you were one of this elite group of companies, wow, you did really, really well. If you weren't, not so much. Okay, well, let's fast forward, if you like, to 20 years later, almost 17 years later, 2020. Let's put a different context on this, where we are today. And clearly, we're all talking about digital. Well, digital, I don't need to tell you, has been dramatic. In 2008, I was running Dell.com, at the time, the world's largest e-commerce operation. And we were a relatively outlier in that about 50% of our business as a corporation at Dell, so close to approaching 15 billion US at the time, was being done by electronic commerce. That's hardly an exciting story today. E-commerce has been dramatic. Similarly, people's expectations of support and all forms of value chain activity through digital has changed. We're seeing a big shift away from telephony. We're seeing a shift towards multimodal ways of supporting customers. Perhaps even more exciting, digital customer experience has created innovation. One of the areas that we're very active in, sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and I know this is a relevant conversation in India as well, is the growth of mobile money and the way we can serve unbanked populations. So an area I focus on is, for example, M-Pesa in Kenya, which has had a huge impact on the transition from traditional banking to digital. So in the light of that, today, most companies are saying, all right, we have a new imperative. And our imperative has to be competing through some kind of digital customer experience hybrid. We want to embrace digital. We want to use that digital to deliver customer experience. We have to play the catch up, or we have to at very least successfully compete in this new universe. And the pandemic, in some ways, I would argue, is not really anything new as much as it's an accelerant for something that was already in place. If you think that 1995, Michael Dell created Dell.com, and this was an era where you saw Jay Walker creating Priceline, eBay was starting to get going, of course, Amazon. All of these early illustrations of electronic commerce, of electronic marketplaces, 1995, long time ago. We've been on a long curve. And in fact, in 2008, 1998, 1999, I was giving speeches, much younger man, I hasten to add, about how retail was going to be transformed by e-commerce. Well, I was right. My timing was terrible. It turned out to take 20 years much longer. The pandemic, like in many ways all wars, has been an accelerant for an existing trend. There's nothing new happening today. It's just everything's happening in an accelerated fashion. And that's unlikely to revert back to its previous state. But what does it mean to think about this in the context of digital? Well, first of all, financial models need to change. One of the biggest challenges companies have is they think along the wrong financial parameters. Now, you might think this is an incredibly boring topic, but it was interesting hearing the last panelist talk about valuation of data and assets. Data doesn't exist on the balance sheet. Neither does essentially customer exist on the balance sheet. Everything is retrospective when we look at P&Ls. In fact, most profit and loss accounts do not adequately reflect the value of customer lifetime value, or essentially customer equity. Don Peppers, the famous founder of the Peppers and Rogers Group, actually believes that customer equity and enterprise value are essentially the same thing. In other words, the enterprise is only worth the sum of its customer equity. Now, that's not a widely held view, but it's a very logical view. So companies are still struggling to get the right financial measures in place to reflect a new universe of lifetime customer value. And that matters because if they're not measuring themselves the right way financially, they're going to have tremendous trouble making the right management steps. Obviously, the second thing is how do we capitalize on digital, which is on everyone's mind. Although I would argue many companies don't think about digital technologies much beyond, can we do e-commerce? Can we do electronic support? Digital is really about all forms of interaction with the customer. But the most important thing out of all of this is how do we accelerate the pace of business? Because at the end of the day, time is one of the most precious competitive advantages when it comes to dealing with a customer. If you are aware of customer problems faster, you respond faster, you retain more customers. If you are aware of customer preference faster, if you are able to respond in real time, you have a massive advantage over competition that basically has a 6-month or a 12-month analysis cycle. So speed is a competitive advantage in the digital era. Okay, so all of this to say, we are where we are today. What does the sort of future look like? How do we should start thinking about what is sort of beyond NPS? Now that's a little bit of a misleading title because I'm not here to suggest that NPS is going away as an idea. I'm suggesting that if we don't start thinking like those early adopters in 2003, we're not going to gain any real advantages from this opportunity presented to us. So what does this all sort of look like? Well, my primary thesis, having been in the CX technology industry now for 15 to 20 years, is that by and large, we've failed to capitalize on the opportunity and the shift to digital. We've sort of stayed analog in a digital world. Most companies survey their customers. Surveying is a 1960s technology. It's a clipboard. We may have web-enabled it, but it's still a web-enabled clipboard. And so in some ways, thinking of survey technology as digital is kind of like strapping a battery onto a buggy whip and calling it a Tesla. You're not actually moving up to a digital era. You're simply digitizing a very traditional technology. What should the next generation of technology look like? What are the solutions going to look like? Well, forget technology for a second. What do we want out of this? What are characteristics of a great solution for the next decade? Well, let's start with a basic premise that almost every business leader wants. They want to know where they are with every single customer every day. And that speaks to requirements for speed. It speaks to requirements for a comprehensive view of customers. And it speaks to the requirements for understanding performance of customers. So why is that speed, that coverage so important? Well, anyone who's run a business will tell you that if you can act to reduce risk in your customer base quickly, you are likely to have a profound impact on being able to actually adjust that customer base. If you fail to act quickly enough, your challenge is that time is actually going to be your primary problem. You're going to actually lose. You're going to lose too much speed, and that's not going to have any profound impact on your business. The second problem that any executive, I think, would tell you today is the organization is not functionally aligned around the customer. It's functionally aligned around, well, functions. It's siloed. Now, why is that so important? Well, we've now got about 60, 70 years of management thinking going back to Taylorism in the 1950s that tells us how to optimize functions in companies. The problem is almost every significant customer-related problem is not functionally oriented, it's cross-functionally oriented. And so the frustration is, how do you pull teams together? And teams are often looking at disparate metrics that aren't connected. They're looking at very proprietary metric sets within their own functions. Maybe they're declaring victory, saying, we're doing a great job in our part of the world. Maybe here in manufacturing, everything's fantastic. And so companies are highly misaligned, and that's creating a lot of friction in trying to get execution of end-to-end customer journeys. So we need to solve that problem. That's a big one. And finally, we need to figure out how to be prescriptive about operational performance. Now, what I mean by that, it might sound a little bit convoluted, is that most companies operate through a series of clearly measured performance indicators. Maybe it's 5 to 10 to 20 indications operationally as to how their performance. If you think about a manufacturer, maybe it's shipping performance, quality performance. If you think about financial services institutions, maybe it's more about responsiveness in contact centers. But whichever way you look at it, companies are run according to this formula, and they're trying to establish a series of parameters and metrics that define success for them. In other words, if we execute at this level, we're going to create great outcomes. We're going to create great customer results, and we're going to transform our business, or we're going to at least execute to the standard we need to. So we need that formula, and for many companies, they don't have a way to accurately understand how their operations are going to lead to the creation of promoters, to great customer outcomes. So we need to fix that. So how possible is this? Can we start moving in this direction? Well, I would argue the first thing we want to understand if we want to get to real time is we need to sort of think about this as an increase in frame rate. And I'll use this as an example. Steamboat Willie, Walt Disney's original cartoon, is incomparable with Toy Story, a Pixar cartoon. The increase in frame rate isn't even the right metaphor. Steamboat Willie was a very low frame rate animation, but Pixar is a completely different technology. What it does, however, is it creates much more definition, and definition of what customers is what we need. We need a vastly richer view of the data than we're ever going to get from this Steamboat Willie era technology. And clearly I'm likening most customer experience programs, survey programs, to Steamboat Willie. We need to increase the frame rate of customers, get much more detail, much more in real time. That's foundational for us to moving up the analytics maturity curve. So most companies today are struggling to collect adequate, high quality real data around customers. And they're barely getting to the point where they're capable of understanding their performance. This is after 20 years of focusing on collecting survey data. So it's clearly not yielding them higher value analytics. What they want to do is get much more sophisticated view of root cause of performance. And they'd really like to get to models where they can predict how customers are going to behave. They can predict what's going on with their customer base, and ideally even optimize the performance of their customer journeys. They're nowhere near that. And my premise would be that unless they fix the frame rate problem, unless they get much better data, it's impossible to come up beyond this basic ad hoc reporting environment and move to higher levels like predictive and optimization. But if we can fix the raw data problem, and more on that in a second, we can move up the optimization chain. What's this solution going to look like? How is this going to take shape? Well, one thing we learned in the noughties, if you like, in 2000 era, was it has to make methodological sense. What do I mean by that? Well, it means that whatever we measure has to connect to financials. Remember, the big appeal for Net Promoter Score was financial linkage. Okay, so that has to happen. It means CX management and measurement needs to hit financial performance. And we need to have a very clear set of linkages that says everything that we're doing connects ultimately to financial performance metrics. And I think one of the panelists on the last presentation said, look, you have to have very clear objectives for what you're measuring. Well, our clear mandate here is to measure in ways that impact financials. There is a sophisticated set of CX metrics that are well designed and, if properly implemented, will link to financials. So we don't want to throw those away. We want to be able to really accurately link to these highly tuned metrics. And we want to be able to run more sophisticated analytics, as we already said. So this connection, this methodology, needs to be very robust. This is not simply basic data science where we're looking for correlations, perhaps, or cause, where we're looking for a sophisticated model of interlocking metrics, because without that, management won't have confidence, will have financial impact. We need to capitalize on data exhaust to get there. So if we're going to use data as a method to model this, we need to use all the data that's available to us. And that doesn't mean that all the data is going to get used. It means we're going to tap into sources of data that are very informative. There is a lot of data in most organizations. 60–70% of it's not being used. What we need is a map to find the bits of data there that are useful. We can discard the pieces that aren't, and we can use those. Unfortunately, Machine learning is very good at this. We need to be predictive. So we can no longer rely on data we get back from surveys. We need to predict customers as opposed to actually asking them. Now that might seem crazy, but customer behavior is basically fairly predictable. So over the last 15, 20 years, companies I've run have issued surveys in the numbers that probably run into the 100 millions of surveys being issued over a period of time, substantial numbers. And what we've seen in patterns is that actually most customers respond in fairly predictable ways. If you treat customers a certain way, they will become promoters or detractors. So we can predict whether customers are promoters or detractors. We don't necessarily need to ask them. And predictive analytics have substantial advantages, not the least of which is you're not subject to a survey response rate of 5% and only asking customers once or twice a year. You're getting predictive data every single day. So if we can capitalize on data exhausts, apply the right methodology, use this to predict customers, we're much further ahead. And that data set also gives us this unified customer view. Now that may sound like a counterintuitive leap, but let me make the suggestion that going from a comprehensive model of what predicts a promoter allows you to back into the performance of every component in the business. And the challenge for creating this is not pulling data together, but making sense of that data. Otherwise, you end up with a series of sort of counter-indicative metrics. Marketing has one set, sales has another, operations has a third. They need to be harmonized. And the best way to harmonize them is to link them together in a way that the customer perceives them. So I'm hopefully making the connection in your mind between this predictive model of NPS and this harmonized customer view. So I know this is a lot to take in. Let's think about some of the implications, though. Ultimately, companies moving towards these kind of new models are the next generation innovators. It's back in 2003. They're deriving the significant successful advantage. The technologies required to do this, most of which are foundationally machine learning technologies, are neither that new nor that radical. What's new is the ability to organize the data in a particular way to yield particular outcomes. And so that's really the opportunity we have. So put bluntly, the next generation of NPS, what is beyond it, is still a form of Net Promoter Score. It's just a Net Promoter Score that's both predicted by machine learning, not based exclusively on survey data, and provides a much richer set of real-time, perhaps high frame rate data about your customers. And that, from our perspective, is the future of NPS. And if you need to get in touch with me for any reason, LinkedIn's probably the best way to do it. I appreciate you taking the time at the end of a busy day for you all.